and welcome everyone to Critical Tech Talk 6. I'm going to start recording just so everyone's aware that we are recording. Alexi, I know you're out there waiting for the cue, but I'm going to do it myself, if that's okay. Oh, maybe you already did it. Okay, you're on the ball. So this is Critical Tech Talk 6, and we call this series is about honest talks about innovation. So this really isn't a series about celebrating entrepreneurship and capitalism. It's a series that it engages in some of the more difficult questions about impacts of technology on society, and on the more than human condition. So before we get started, I do have these thank yous. First of all, this whole series is funded by the Office of Research, all 6 faculties at the University of Waterloo. And I want to thank Wendy Philpott and the Faculty of Arts for keeping this, adding updates on the website and doing marketing for us. I want to thank Communitech, who also co-sponsored this iteration of the series, and Sabrina McAllister at Communitech for assisting with promotion. And then last but not least, Alexi Orchard, who is here in ghost form, watching over everything and holding it all together. Now, I mentioned that all 6 faculties support Critical Tech Talk, and this one is co-hosted by the Faculty of Science. So with that, we have a recorded introduction to this event from the Dean's office. This is Jonathan Witt, the Associate Dean International in the Faculty of Science. And I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen and play this video, if you'll bear with me for one moment.
Hello, my name is Jonathan Witt, and I'm the Associate Dean International in the Faculty of Science at the University of Waterloo. I'd like to start with a territorial acknowledgement. The University of Waterloo is located on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. The university is situated on the Haldimand Tract, land promised to the 6 nations, which includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. I'd like to welcome you to today's conference entitled Clean Energy, Climate Justice, and Indigenous Rights, from Extractive Colonial Capitalism to Equitable Flourishing Alternatives. And it is with much apprehension that I must also welcome you to a year that is well on its way to becoming globally the warmest since measurements began. With fires raging across Canada, it is our Indigenous communities that are most affected, with evacuations and displacements across the country. It is very clear that climate justice and a clean energy transition must play a central role in our reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. This conference could not be more timely. Enjoy the program, and thank you.
All right. Thank you, Jonathan. And thank you for the land acknowledgement. I'm Marcelo Gorman. I haven't introduced myself. I'm coming to you off campus today at my home on the bank of the Speed River. This is Treaty 4 territory, and I'm grateful to have access to the traditional shoreland of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and neutral peoples. When I go out on the Speed River in my canoe in the evening, sometimes I often get bumped by beavers, and they remind me that this is not my river. And in a cryptic way, this is why we give land acknowledgements. Now, before we get into the talk, I want to tell a very brief story. I know this isn't about me today, but I think it's relevant. Last week, I published a fairly provocative piece in the Globe and Mail about the racism and colonialism on which AI is built. And that evening, I had some unfortunate, some colorful hate mail in my inbox, including a poem that read, "Colonialism, racism, blah, blah, moron, colonialism, colonialism, racism, colonialism, Marcel the blithering idiot." So I'm not trying to humble brag here. I recite this brilliant poem only to point out the increasingly hate-filled context of the activist work in which our guest speakers are engaging. All I did to ignite hate was write an op-ed. Our speakers today, committed activists, put themselves at much greater risk for the sake of defending Indigenous rights. And with that, I'm honored to introduce these speakers. First, we have Ariel Tsekwe, that's probably not right, Ariel, I'm sorry, Deranger, who's a Dene mother from the Athabasca Chippewayan First Nation and the executive director and co-founder of Indigenous Climate Action, an Indigenous-led climate justice organization in so-called Canada. Deranger is a member of the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change and was a founding member of the Global Indigenous Youth Caucus. After that, we will have a brief talk, 10 minutes each approximately, by Jen Gabi, who's a settler living on a small farm on unceded Abenaki territory in rural Quebec. She has a PhD from McGill and is an affiliate assistant professor at Concordia. She's the author of More Powerful Together, Conversations with Climate Activists and Indigenous Land Defenders, and founder of Research for the Front Lines, where she currently works, supporting the research needs of communities and movements fighting for climate and environmental justice across so-called Canada. After these two talks, we'll have a response and questions from Professor Trevor Charles, who is Professor of Biology at the University of Waterloo. He's director of the Waterloo Center for Microbial Research, founder of the company Metagenome Bio, and executive director of the Liftoff Black Entrepreneurship Program. So I'm done talking, and I'm going to pass it over to Ariel now. So Ariel, please take it away. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Masicho, Iglanete, Denesotoneta, Ariel Tsekwe Hushe, Deranger Bitsini Hesli. My name is Ariel Tsekwe Deranger. It was pretty good. It was pretty close. I'm a member of the Athabasca Chippewan First Nation, and I just always introduce myself in my traditional language to help ground myself. I am located in just outside of Amiskwichi-Waskahigan in the Enoch Cree Nations territory in Treaty 6, but I'm a member of a Treaty 8 nation. So I'm also a guest here where I live. And I'm very grateful to be able to live where I do right now. I really want to start off. I'm going to have some slides as we get into this topic in this conversation. So thank you so much, Marcel, for that sort of introduction into this idea that people don't want to confront colonialism as one of these precursors to the problems that we are facing on a broad scale, and particularly when we're talking about climate change. This is a lot of the work that Indigenous Climate Action, the organization that I helped found in 2015, really is looking to tackle and really bring into the mainstream as part of our narrative shifts of how we don't just talk about the climate crisis, but talk about the root causes and solutions pathways. So with that, I'm probably not gonna share all my slides. I like slides as a way to sort of keep me on task, so to speak. So again, I just really want to thank Waterloo University and all of the staff from the different faculties, and Jen for introducing me to the folks here and inviting me into this conversation. So for Indigenous Climate Action, one of the things that we like to frame the climate crisis is that colonialism not caused, but causes climate change. And that is this understanding that colonialism is an ongoing process, but we also have to understand its historical roots and why we name it as being a part of this process. And when we first start with this, we need to understand the context by which Indigenous peoples and colonialism has occurred, both locally and internationally. So global Indigenous populations represent about 5% of the population. In Canada, it also is about 5% of the population. And that roughly is around 550 million people worldwide, with over 5,000 distinct groups recognized in over 90 countries. And I want you to hear recognized, because there are Indigenous peoples that are unrecognized in many other countries beyond the 90 that have recognized Indigenous peoples. And where it gets really interesting is that Indigenous peoples occupy and use somewhere between 22 and 64% of the world's land surface, which is a big debate because some people say it's not actually 64% and others say it is as high as 64% in order to maintain Indigenous lifeways. And of those landscapes, it represents 80% of the world's biodiversity. which is essential for climate stabilization, and even more so as an indication to where Indigenous peoples have played a critical role in protecting biodiversity, is that 85% of the world's protected and conservation areas are within and or adjacent to recognized Indigenous lands and territories, where in many cases Indigenous peoples have been advocating for the protection and preservation of those ecosystems in relation to their culture and lifeways. A lot of the work in understanding Indigenous rights in modern context has come from the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which sets forth the bare minimum standards for legal frameworks for upholding the unique rights of Indigenous peoples. And yet that was only passed in 2007. And since 2007, we have seen this really quick escalation of the recognition of Indigenous peoples, but there's still a lot of challenges on what this actually means in relation to the legal frameworks, treaty obligations that exist within state regions all over the world. And no more, we can talk about Canada, where we have these pre-existing treaty agreements that Canada loves to talk about. We like to say that, oh, we're such a great country because we've signed these agreements. Look at peace and friendship. We agreed to share the land. But as most people are starting to understand, this is not actually the case. While Canada has a set of numbered treaties that span between Quebec and into the territories across the country and into the territories, many of these agreements have and continue to be violated and are broken. And what's even more interesting is within the context of treaty making, some of the earlier treaties, including the Royal Proclamation of 1762 or maybe 1763, I always get the number wrong right now and I don't have my notes in front of me, stated that Canada would not be occupied or taken, like no country would be taken over without a treaty agreement. Yet there are vast territories of so-called Canada that remain untreated, meaning there has been no agreement on how those lands and territories will be utilized. And much of the yellow that we see on this map are the untreated territories. Yet Canada has proclaimed these regions as part of the Confederation of Canada, again, a violation of those early treaties. And so we can see that these treaty negotiations weren't really great, and that there is a justification and a reasoning for the implementation and recognition and upholding of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And furthermore, these treaty agreements have been broken further to that because when we look at the landscapes, again, treaty territories looks vast. We're going to share these lands and resources. Come on, guys. But in actuality, what has happened is that First Nations communities that sign these treaty agreements have actually only been given full control over 0.2% of the land mass that is known as Canada, where the other 99.8% remains under the jurisdiction of the Crown. This is not sharing. This is an oppressive state coming in and saying, sorry, we're going to sign this agreement, but we're actually going to degrade it further, and we're going to be the ultimate judge, jury, and executor of everything, and we'll consult with you every now and then and maybe compensate you. So the reality is Canada was built on stolen land. It's a celebration of white supremacy, colonial violence, ongoing land theft, and Indigenous genocide. And in the context of the climate crisis, we have to start thinking about the fact that Canada plays a huge role, and our ecosystems play a huge role in stabilizing the atmosphere. And when we look at what's happening with the forest fires, as our forest fires burns, our capacity not only to reduce emissions is harmed, but also we're increasing emissions into the atmosphere. But our forests have the capacities, our ecosystems rather, have the capacities to sequester 22% of the world's emissions if they were properly cared for. And so we often look at Canada and this carbon map. So this is high, so because it's not just forests, it's also the soil. So we don't often think about the soils or the marshlands or other ecosystems in Canada as being high carbon sequestration. But I don't want to talk about science too much, because this is the reason I'm showing these maps is because for our people, these are not simply carbon stores. That's not what it is. To us, these are our lands and territories. They are the territories of the Dene and the the Woodland Cree and the Soto and the Ojibwe and the Algonquin and the Mi'kma'ki and the Salish and the Kwakwaka'wakw and like so on and so on and so on. And these are important attributes to who we are as people. I am Athabasca Chippewa First Nation, or Kaitale Dene Sotlene. And our name Kaitale means people of the willow, and is a reference to the territories where we come from, which is in the Peace Athabasca Delta, which is a watershed, a major watershed that houses the last remaining inland freshwater delta, or the largest freshwater delta, inland freshwater delta in the world. And we live amongst the willows. And as the industries that are downstream from our territories, and here we can see what happens when our lands and territories are put under the management of colonial frameworks that don't see our landscapes as these sacred places, as these places that are intricately connected to who we are. We see simply these lands as resources to be extracted. And we start to see this sector. And then when you start to see what the anthropogenic footprint is, you start to see that the anthropogenic footprint is so closely tied to the industrialization and extractivism of our territories, which has laid havoc on our landscapes, on our community's socio and spiritual well-being. And this is not unique. Let's remember that colonialism is not something that Canadian Indigenous peoples experience and is some unique experience, but European empires have colonized vast territories across the world where very similar stories can be heard. And this is what we mean by colonialism causes climate change. There's this ongoing extractivism that continues to this day, that continues to take lands from our territories, erode them through extractive industries. In my territory, we have the Alberta tar sands, which has laid havoc to our water systems, our ecosystems, keystone species such as caribou, bison, moose, including other species like waterfowl, muskrats. The lynx in our region are completely gone, and so on and so on and so forth. Our entire air quality has been impacted, and that ultimately affects the health of our communities. And it has affected our ability to continue practicing our treaty rights, which we negotiated for hunting, fishing, trapping, gathering, accessing our lands and territories, which have now been leased out to multinational corporations. Also, people can continue to reap profits while our communities don't just bear the consequences of extractivism, but are now bearing the consequences of the climate crisis. Whereas just last month, my entire community in Fort Chipewyan was evacuated because of forest fires in a delta. Forest fires in a delta. Do you understand how absurd that is? We are talking about a wetland that was burning, and an entire community had to be evacuated because of forest fires. So we're not just feeling the insults and degradation from the extractive industry, but we are bearing the consequences of the climate crisis when we have been the least to commit or to contribute to it. So for us at Indigenous Climate Action and much of the global Indigenous movement, see systems of colonialism, patriarchy, capitalism, white supremacy, and extractivism as the root causes to the climate crisis. And this is where, we want to talk about solutions, of course. So the big thing is that there has been recognition time and time again that Indigenous peoples hold some critical key answers to how we can address the climate crisis. And, drawing on traditional knowledge and other technologies to find solutions that society at large can replicate these pending changes. The reality is we don't need people to come in and tell us how to prepare and adapt and mitigate the climate crisis. We're already our own experts. We have some of the best biologists, hydrologists. We understand the landscapes. We have years, millennia of observational science that help us understand and adapt to our environments in ways that other people cannot. And I also want to state that Indigenous peoples have held a critical role in advancing the call to action within the UNFCCC, United Nations Forum Convention on Climate Change basis, since its inception in 1992 with the Rio Summit, where Indigenous peoples met beforehand to build a declaration called the Carioca Declaration, which stated that we needed to look at the climate crisis by integrating a framework that looked at our interconnections with the natural world, our spiritual connections, our cultural connections, and that Indigenous peoples needed to be at the forefronts of this. What's really interesting is that as we move into modern day right now, last year in Glasgow and last year in Egypt, Indigenous peoples were the second largest civil society delegation within these spaces, with the first and the largest civil society delegation within these spaces being oil and gas. Oil and gas executives are trying to lobby and change the hearts and minds of states to allow and continue oil and gas to go unfettered in the wake of the global climate crisis. And Indigenous peoples are right behind them, trying to implore that we understand that this is not a crisis that can be saved, that can be fixed simply by addressing greenhouse gas emissions and mathematical equations, but is one that requires us to reevaluate our relationships with the lands and the ecosystems and the places we come from, and taking guidance from Indigenous peoples that have the millennia of knowledge to help guide those solutions. And we've done this type of work at ICA, which Jen has helped with the decolonizing climate policy and research, where we're really exploring ways in which we can build decolonial systems, not ways to indigenize colonial structures, but what does it mean for us to build alternatives that are decolonial in framework and that are supporting the sovereignty and self-determination of communities, and really advancing this idea of legal pluralisms and upholding Indigenous legal frameworks, not just colonial systems. We're also trying to call out the false solutions that are co-opting Indigenous cosmovision and value systems and perverting them into structures that further uphold systems of capitalism under the banner of nature-based solutions. And we continue to build education programs, resources, and engagement that focus on empowering Indigenous peoples to step into their legal rights, their internationally affirmed rights, and their moral and legal frameworks as Indigenous peoples back in their home territories. And so what are these solutions? The reality is that there's this mythos that Indigenous peoples had no systems of economies, no systems of innovation until and suddenly we were just on the landscape following the buffalo like some nomadic people that didn't know anything. But the reality is we had thriving commerce and trade routes that spanned through the Americas. We had innovation, including the syringe and rubber and suspension bridges and aspirins and baby nipples and so on and so forth. But urban colonialism or ongoing colonialism continues to this day that really tries to diminish the values that Indigenous peoples and in uplifting the solutions. But when we look at what Indigenous energy sovereignty means, it means the implementation and the transformation and the merging of our two structures together to find solutions that aren't about going back to something, but about recentering value systems that uplift the values and lifeways of communities. We've seen this being implemented by communities in so-called Canada already with renewable energy projects like wind and solar and geothermal. We're seeing communities advance food sovereignty and food security issues that are looking at ways to reduce their footprint and provide good food for their communities. We're seeing how the reclaiming of our lands and territories and our name places utilizing GSI technology and mapping not only helps us identify these places, but helps us understand those ecosystems in ways that Western scientists simply do not. And in the last piece is that we have to understand that these innovations and technologies, when we bring them together and we allow Indigenous peoples to speak to these knowledge systems and our data in our own voices and have control over how it's used, it can create new solutions and innovations that not only address the local issues that have historically marginalized these communities, but that contribute to the global strategies of combating the climate crisis through localized economies like moose hide tanning that is being taken off by storm, which creates local economies for Indigenous women, revitalizes culture, reconnects people to the lands, to the reclamation and revitalization of the harvest of wild rice out in the Algonquin territory. Again, same thing, this is a food security thing, more food security of helping to bring back fish runs and address the climate crisis in the West Coast. On and on we go. We see how Indigenous peoples are pushing forward innovation that utilizes their culture and their knowledge as a platform, rather than relying on colonial systems that have done nothing but suppress Indigenous voices and knowledge for centuries. And that's the end for me. I'm going to pass it off to Jen. I feel like I've gone way over.
Wow. Thank you. So much there. Yeah, and so many questions I'm sure the audience has. And it's okay if you'd like to start asking questions right now. If you have questions, you're listening to this, you can start putting them in the Q&A, and we will put them there and then respond to them after the speakers have had their say. So thank you so much, Ariel. And yeah, Jen, it's your turn. Please take it away.
Okay. So thank you, Ariel, for laying down such beautiful context for this talk today. I'm going to follow you here. It's an honor to speak with you. I'll follow you here with talking about some of the research I've been involved with that's really gathering even more evidence to show the dynamics you're naming, Ariel. So I wanted to bring up this one research project I was involved with a couple of years ago. We published an article in Environmental Research Letters. It was a systematic mapping of 649 cases of environmental conflict around the world, based on the Environmental Justice Atlas. You can check that out if you're interested. But it was looking at both fossil fuel and sort of dirty energy projects, but also looking at conflicts created by low carbon energy projects as well. And the main finding of this paper was that low carbon renewable energy and mitigation projects are as conflictive as fossil fuel projects, and both are disproportionately impacting vulnerable groups such as rural community and Indigenous peoples. So what we're seeing here is still locked into this colonial capitalism that is meaning that our efforts towards green energy are just playing out in ways that are replicating the very injustices that the fossil fuel industry is known for. We're seeing that now with clean energy. So to give a sense, you'll see here in this part of the graph, oil and gas extraction was sort of responsible for 160 of the cases documented here of those 649 cases of environmental conflict, where communities are standing up to defend their lands and territories and communities from oil and gas. We're seeing about the same amount resisting hydro, large-scale hydro projects, which are considered clean energy. We're seeing also solar, wind, and other renewables, and land and biomass-based mitigation also having, also triggering these conflicts and communities defending themselves against these injustices and these impositions. So to give a sense of some of those impacts, this table shares some of the social and ecological impacts from different ones. So from wind and solar, we're seeing landscape loss, livelihood loss, land dispossession, people being displaced, increasing corruption, as well as biodiversity loss, deforestation, etc. And on. I'm happy to share my slides. So if you want to check this out in more detail, you can read the paper. But we're seeing this with geothermal plants, with hydro. So we're seeing these kind of disproportional impacts to already marginalized communities happening due to clean energy projects around the world. The paper also kept track of these frequency of repressive outcomes. So when environmental conflicts, when community resistance, community land defense led to criminalization of activists, death of activists, like assassinations, repression, corruption, migration, or displacement, we're seeing similar numbers, similar order of magnitude here. These things happen in similar numbers, whether it's oil and gas or whether it's clean energy projects. This is very, very problematic, and it shows why there needs to be this really concerted effort to really name what actual just energy transitions look like, and ensuring that this kind of dynamic is not continuing. So what we're seeing here, yes, we know we need to solve the climate crisis that is burning across the world right now, and we do need clean energy. But what we're seeing is a sort of move towards extractive, large-scale, corporate-owned, for-profit models of green energy. And these kind of solutions are perpetuating the same dynamics we saw with the fossil fuels. They're just new iterations, new manifestations of extractivism and exploitation. So if we're going to be upholding Indigenous rights and fighting for a climate and just future, we need a transformation of the very systems of power, governance, worldviews, and values that have been driving the crisis. So to be clear, the kind of projects we've been calling out here, naming, are the mainstream government and corporate-led clean energy, but there are clean energy projects going on across the world and across so-called Canada, some of which Ariel alluded to or spoke of in her presentation, that are community-led, based on community needs, that are small scale, where the benefits are accrued to the community, not to the CEOs of large multinational corporations. So in an effort to sort of think about what this means in the tech innovation world, so maybe a lot of you here who joined today are in innovation fields or in tech fields. And I'd like to think about, given all that we've talked about today, what is the role that the tech and innovation world can have in helping address and transform rather than perpetuate and strengthen colonial capitalism? And so in an effort to do that, I want to point you to one essential reading, which Ariel's organization, ICA, has been involved with, which is Hoodwinked in the Hothouse. It's an amazing primer on understanding the difference between false climate solutions and real climate solutions. And they have some really good specific calls to action for real renewable energy solutions and real hydro solutions, and really naming what those differences are. So I recommend that highly. Also, I came up today off the top of my head with a list of 14 questions you can ask yourself. If you're in the design, tech, and innovation world, if you want to be designing tech innovations that support effective, equitable, and decolonial climate solutions, here are some things you can be asking yourself. So maybe our friend Alexia could put this in the chat. I have a Google Doc you're welcome to take home and use for reference in your future work. But some of the questions, I won't go through them all because we want to go to discussion, but some of the questions are, what possible unintended consequences might your tech innovation lead to? Deal with those in the design phase. Don't wait for them to happen to see what they might be. What natural resources and extractive exploitative processes will it require to build out your solution at the scale you imagine? Whose lands, lives, and labor are likely to be required? What can you do to ensure your tech solution does not require extraction, production, transportation, consumption, and disposal processes that further environmental racism, injustice through disproportionate impacts to already marginalized communities? Are you the companies, universities, and governments that you work with committed to upholding inherent Indigenous, inherent treaty, constitutional, and international rights that Ariel talked about, including the right to free, prior, informed consent? Because if they are not, it's likely your solution will be violating these rights. Does your tech solution lend itself to small scale, community-owned, collaborative, cooperative, nonprofit models? If not, why not? And how could it be? What is being funded in your field of research and why? By whom and towards what interests? What are some of the uncommon or some of the common spoken or unspoken assumptions in your field about what is possible and what's not possible? I think this is super important to think about. I hear all the time people in the tech world assuming that climate change is at the core a technological problem, and economists think it's at the heart an economic problem. We all have a tendency towards tunnel vision, but we need to be seeing beyond these tunnel visions and knowing that there are very, very important social equity and justice dynamics here to everything you might be doing related to climate and clean energy. And you need to be thinking about what your assumptions are about what's possible and what's involved here. So think about who does and doesn't have the power to decide how to use your tech innovation, how it's going to be used once it's out of your hands. Think about, is your tech innovation grounded in real community needs and interests? When you look around you in your office, lab, or field, are there people from marginalized communities there? Are the people most impacted by the issues you want to address? Are they represented in your workplace? If not, how can that change? What are some of the ways you can collaborate closely with folks from impacted communities to co-design tech solutions that work for them, that directly serve their needs and interests? And maybe you can consider offering some of your time, skills, and labor pro bono to community-led solutions, the beautiful kind of solutions that Ariel was talking about. And if you're not sure how to go about that, I'll just take a moment to talk about research for the frontlines. That's exactly what we do. We are a network. We link up folks who have skills, time, and labor to offer in universities across Canada, and we link them up with community and movement groups that have research needs but are under-resourced and can use the support. So yeah, we establish and support these research collaborations, and in general, our goals and priorities are to support frontline communities and movements to lead their own research on their own terms, to design and implement their own solutions, as well as we're exploring research. What does research as allyship look like? It'd be interesting to think about what innovation as allyship might look like. And we're trying to develop practices and forms of research outside of academia, outside of and against extractive and colonial paradigms, whether we're talking about resource extraction or knowledge extraction. We're trying to work outside these paradigms. And we're trying to provide research volunteers with opportunities for skilling up, to be able to do the kind of research that is in service to frontline communities and actively contribute to the fight for environmental climate justice in so-called Canada. So I'll also share our website, but it's researchforthefrontlines.ca. We're always looking for new volunteers, so consider that. It's one way to contribute to the amazing work that's going on around this so-called Canada on the ground for real solutions. And I'll stop there.
Jen, you made a resource for us. That's incredible.
Yeah.
I will make sure that gets circulated at Waterloo anyway, as far and wide as I can. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that, for all of that. And I hope you get some people take you up on the challenge that you're putting out to them. So now we're going to have, I'm going to yield the floor to Trevor Charles, who may have a question, may have a response. I'm not sure. That's the way this works. This is supposed to be a conversation, and the conversation starts now, and the three of you can feel free to just let it flow as you see fit. Trevor, you go ahead and take it away, please.
Great, thanks. So thank you, Ariel and Jen. That was an amazing perspective that you provided us. And, so many thoughts are going through my head. One thing I really agree with is this idea of nature-based solutions. That term has really been co-opted, and I've seen it. And I'm not really sure how to address it, because in one way, it's actually directly opposed to mainstream science. And then on the other side, it seems to be co-opting the other non-mainstream science, right? And it's sort of like in the middle there, and it's sort of almost like it's wanting to be the best of everything. And I'm not sure that it's doing that. I think that it's very diminished. And I'd just like you to maybe get your response to that, and maybe tease that out a little bit more and sort of figure out where that came from.
I think this is a really topical and important conversation right now. Within the UNFCCC negotiations, the conversation on nature-based solutions has really taken off, and it is that co-optation of an alternative approach that has been driven by the push from social justice movement organizations, Indigenous peoples, that we simply can't look at just like switching one energy to another. Like, that's been the whole framework. We need to be looking for other solutions that are led by nature. Like, this is literally what the calls from Indigenous peoples in these spaces were for decades. And then suddenly there's been this co-optation by the very same corporations to say, oh, we'll lead the nature-based solutions. But since Kyoto in 1994, oh God, I don't know if that's when it was. I can't remember. But the Kyoto Agreement was the first climate agreement. And there was huge pushback from the social justice movements and Indigenous peoples that this agreement was more concerned with looking at economic solutions. They were like, how do we save the economy? And how do we reduce the crisis to a mathematical equation that looks at calculating and measuring GHGs? And there was this huge push that we can't reduce the climate crisis to an economic crisis. So fast forward all the way to Copenhagen 2009, where there's a massive push that a new agreement was going to be made that was going to be better than than Kyoto. But it all fell apart because human rights activists and Indigenous peoples, this is 2 years after the passing of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, are saying this agreement still sucks because it's not incorporating that value system that the Carioca Declaration called for, which is this idea that we are connected to nature, that we need to listen to nature and listen to natural law. And suddenly they can't come to an agreement. And we fast forward to Paris, where suddenly there's recognition and text that includes human rights, includes Indigenous rights, includes Indigenous peoples and our knowledge systems. And there was very quickly after Paris, an entire co-optation of that language that supported and allowed businesses the social license to continue operating business as usual. We're looking at nature-based solutions coming in the form of Indigenous protected and conservation areas, which governments are like so poorly underfunding that many of these communities can no longer actually maintain these protected and conservation areas. And then they're getting not picked on, but like basically preyed upon by corporations like Shell Oil, Exxon, Husky, that are like, oh, we really want to support this as long as we can use it as a mechanism to reduce our emissions. Nature-based solution. And we're looking at the fact that we have created a market-based solution. Nature-based solutions are being co-opted and included in finding ways to continue perpetuating systems of extractivism and capitalism and white supremacy, and are doing nothing to actually change the lives of Indigenous peoples, and are actually increasing the risks to land grabs and sort of the sort of predatory approach of Indigenous lands and territories by other groups. And it's really, really scary because we can't simply look at the climate crisis by how do we continue to maintain capitalism. And this is what we're doing. We have asked over and over, we cannot reduce the climate crisis to an economic crisis. But here we are, 2023, moving into the COP28 in Dubai. And the presidency of COP Dubai is the oil executive CEO of one of the biggest and worst offending oil and gas companies from the UAE. We are seeing oil and gas executives continuing to maintain this and quoting things like nature-based solutions as the way that they're going to reduce their emissions. But it's simply a fancy game of playing math, using our language against us, and trying to find ways to co-opt and allow them social licenses to continue business as usual. It's quite perverted. And when we talk about carbon markets that are also being included within nature-based solutions, there's no agreed upon process for even how to calculate carbon emissions. It's like, how are we calculating? Which emissions are we calculating? How are we reducing those emissions? Like, what is the standard practice? Can you actually reduce emissions in Canada by buying a piece of rainforest in South America? My feeling is no. That's just a shell game of trying to hide emissions here and there and everywhere. And nature-based solutions are doing nothing to change the lived experience of Indigenous peoples.
Thank you. Jen, do you have anything to add to that?
I would just direct anyone who's interested in questions of nature-based solutions to read the report that Alexi shared in the chat. ICA put out a report on nature-based solutions and the risks and threats of nature-based solutions to Indigenous communities. And there, I think, I understand, Ariel, that there'll be another report on nature-based solutions coming out this year, on that. So I really recommend folks think about that. At the same time, I think there are some initiatives across the country of Indigenous communities sort of really naming what real nature-based or land-based solutions look like. And those also, some examples of those will also be raised up in ICA's upcoming report on Indigenous-led climate policy. So I think when you say nature-based solutions, that could mean so many different things, some which are so problematic, as Ariel named, and some which are promising if they are led by the Indigenous folks on those territories, and centering those ways of knowing, those ways of relating with the lands. Yeah, that's all I'll add.
Okay.
I just want to add to this, like nature-based solutions in itself is not a bad idea. It's when it's co-opted to support ongoing threat on the land and capitalism and ongoing colonialism that it becomes a problem. The ideology behind it itself isn't bad, it's how it's being perverted.
Yeah, I would agree with that. One of the things that I'm very interested in is the impact of energy poverty on human well-being. And you know, often you see that there's these ideas that one of the ways to, you know, solve climate change is to withhold energy from the people who really need it to lift themselves out of poverty. I wanted to then sort of bring that around to some of the data that you showed, Jen, which I thought was really interesting about the disruptive nature of different energy sources. And also, you know, the ones that were associated with repression. And I noticed that nuclear power in both cases seemed to be least disruptive and least prone to repression. I don't know if there's a common denominator there or not, but the numbers were the lowest. And bring that around to the observation that where I'm living in the province of Ontario, we have one of the cleanest electricity generation systems. And it's not because of wind and solar, it's because of primarily nuclear. And the wind and solar actually cause more natural gas because it's intermittent. So if we had a source of energy that required the least amount of extraction, that was the least disruptive and least prone to repression, but it was not called nuclear. Is that something that could fit into a solution? So, for example, if it's something that gave, you know, had a large number of unionized jobs that could be operated by nonprofits, that could be controlled in the communities, would that be an ideal solution? Or would we be looking for something else?
Ariel, do you want to go for it? Do you want me to take a stab?
I'll just start by saying, I think one of the problems that I find with that kind of framing of a question is that it sort of begs to sort of support the argument that we're just looking for an energy source to replace the existing energy sources that can be scaled at a global level so everyone can have equal access to energy. And one of the things that is really interesting about when you look at Indigenous systems that even existed, let's just say in Turtle Island or North America, is that the diversity of the ways that Indigenous peoples had innovation, economies, technologies, everything was so diverse, and it was created from the local ecosystems and regions. And there has been time and time again, academic paper after academic paper that has stated that what we really need with the climate crisis isn't to find and to build out massive scaled energy systems, but is to work at a regional level to create those systems and structures that work for those regions. And that doesn't just get to an energy crisis, address the energy crisis, but it also helps address those localized economy crises, of localized rights and issues so that the people can be involved in developing localized energy, economic governance structures on how people equally benefit from these projects and know that this is the same ecosystem that they're going to be living in. I think we are constantly in this crisis looking for that silver bullet energy system. And when we start talking about nuclear, sure, it's cleaner as far as emissions in the short term. but and I'm not talking about emissions long term, but the implications that it has on the environment in the long term for nuclear waste, which basically is a forever chemical. And if we start building nuclear on a scale to replace the energy systems, we're going to have a nuclear waste problem, which we've already seen what that looks like for Indigenous communities. Look at the Navajo Nation. My own family was forcibly removed from our territory in northern Saskatchewan in 1979 by armed security for El Dorado, a uranium mining company, because we thought that uranium was going to be the next saving energy panacea for Canada in the 70s. And if it was not for the nuclear non-proliferation movement, we would be a country that would have massive uranium. The Navajo Nation is still dealing with the implications of uranium waste that's being stored in their sacred mountains. I just don't think it's a viable option when we're talking about scaling up energy sources. We have to look more regional.
And I would just add that another thing I see problematic with that thing Ariel named about this panacea, looking for this one thing that's going to replace the fossil fuel big thing, is that we're not talking about the lowest hanging fruit, which is like reducing energy needs. Like you mentioned Ontario, and like these Canada, at least settler Canada is an insanely high consumptive lifestyle, right? We waste energy like crazy, and we think we can just keep that same lifestyle with a new form of energy, just like we think we can drive everywhere with our individual car just now with an electric car instead of a fossil fuel car. And so again, I know it feels daunting and sort of scary to be picking apart at some of the really most common solutions out there, but those solutions are failing because they're actually not addressing the root cause. And one of the root causes, among many, is like massive overconsumption in the global north at the expense of the global south, and in Canada, within settler communities at the expense of Indigenous communities. So I think we need to be talking about, I think the Hoodwinked in the Hothouse report, which I shared in the chat, talks about the need for the over-consuming countries to go on an energy diet. And that's got to be the first step, because there is no one magic thing that's going to allow us to continue this extremely wasteful overconsumption lifestyle.
Not just overconsumption. We have entire energy problems. Our entire grid system needs to be overhauled and reformed. But we're spending all these resources on trying to reduce the emissions per barrel in oil and gas when we're not even paving the way for how to clean up our overconsumption and the way that we're just bleeding energy out into the world. My community was a diesel powered community until recently, when we built the largest off-grid solar farm, which is only touching the surface of how to reduce our emissions in our communities. But the reality is that there's this thing where you run off of diesel, some of you are just not going to have heat or power. we are left in this energy deficit. It's not just in third world countries. We see it being pushed on Indigenous communities across so-called Canada and the United States. There are vast communities in Navajo Nation, the largest Indigenous tribe in the United States, that do not have electricity and running water. So we have real problems in North America and in all the leading G7 countries, where there is massive energy consumption problems, where they're just saying, all these other people need to slow down. We got to fix our problem first before you can even catch up to us. And that's also a bunch of BS. But I just think we can't be looking for what is that actual energy source. We need to be working with those communities, resourcing those communities, and ensuring that we are developing sustainable systems that work for them and that aren't looking at sacrifice zones somewhere else. And that's going to take a whole overhaul of our entire economic structures and energy systems globally.
Yeah, I see we're approaching the hour. We could do this for easily all night. I had a really selfless question. I wanted to ask about EV, because EV is being called, it's the next gold rush, is basically finding critical minerals to power EV and so on. And I think, for the audience, it's they might be asking very basic questions like, I want to switch to an electric vehicle. Is this a way of engaging with climate justice and some of the issues you're getting at today. How would you respond to that?
That's such a complicated question. I mean, when we talk about reducing our energy consumptions, of course, EV is a good solution. But when we talk about the rare minerals that are required to support that, and at the scale that countries like North America are talking about transitioning, it's a problem. And it's a problem that's being felt in Indigenous communities. Again, if you look at the Ring of Fire, where they have found some of these rare minerals that would support this transition, there is pressure. I've heard from communities that they're being pressured and being told that they need to do their part in helping to usher Canada's energy transition by sacrificing their lands for other people. And I don't know how that's justice, because they're not getting like any direct benefits from that. These communities already have energy deficits, energy poverty, water poverty, housing poverty, and now they're being asked to further take a hit so that other people in cities that can afford EV can reduce their footprint. I don't want to say it's a bad idea. Like, obviously we should be looking at solutions, but we also have to be looking at where we're sourcing these minerals to achieve our transition for those that have the privilege to even be able to consider that. And I think there's some major problems in the way that there's still this continuation to prey on Indigenous lands and territories as the battery pack to support urban and colonial lifestyles in Canada and beyond.
Yeah, I'm thinking of the electric Ford F-150 and how many of those will be driven by people who will never put anything in the bed of that truck ever. It's a little bit ridiculous. I want to address some of the questions from the audience here. And the main gist of a couple of these questions is how to engage with Indigenous communities and Indigenous peoples. There's a question about how do you engage with Indigenous people while being conscious not to burden or assign them with work responsibility to educate and in turn benefit non-Indigenous settlers who are working in the tech space? So that's a good question. And the other question is related, right? How do you spread this word to students in the STEM disciplines? Well, you'd want to engage Indigenous people to do that, but again, it's a burden on them, and is it their responsibility? So how would you respond to this?
I just want to say at this point, there's no reason that people can't do their homework. There's so much available online in academic papers, libraries. Like, there's ways for you to do that research on your own. I just think that there's this thing, like, I don't know where to look. It's like, as Indigenous peoples, we are constantly told we need to figure out how to participate and operate within colonial structures and systems. And I can tell you for myself, when I became an adult and realized that the world didn't operate in the same value systems as my Indigenous community, I had like an existential crisis. I was like, what the F is wrong with the world? And I studied political economy. I tried to figure out how these structures were created, where they were born from, how to operate and navigate these systems. If you want to work with Indigenous peoples just as much as I wanted to work within these structures and make change, do your homework. Do not ask Indigenous peoples to teach you unless you are paying for them to do that at a university level course or a course where they're offering to do that. It's such a challenge when people are constantly asking us to give our knowledge for free off the side of our desk when it's not our profession and we're not being paid to do it. There are people that do this for a living and you can pay them.
Yeah. I think that last point is very important about paying them to do this. And I think that I know a lot, and what I'm seeing here in these questions is basically some anxiety about it's like me pronouncing your name, right? About not wanting to get it wrong, and about being fearful of engaging in something that is not Indigenous led, and a fear of co-optation or, Jen, please go ahead.
I just like to say that there's no reason you need to ask Indigenous people to be involved with your thing, because there's Indigenous led projects and campaigns and resistance efforts going on all over the world, all over so-called Canada, that have active calls for solidarity, active calls to action, active ways to donate and support in other ways. So if you'd like to start to build relationships, the way to do that is do your homework, find out what's going on, and respond to one of those like thousands of calls for support that exist from different communities and resistance efforts and solution initiatives all across the country and find ways to contribute. That's the way to start building relationships and trying to contribute. And that doesn't ask anyone of their time other than yours.
I also just want a little reminder. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to say the wrong things. You're going to do the wrong things. You're going to support the wrong things, quote unquote, wrong. But life is literally about making mistakes and learning from them and correcting course. And if you can't accept the fact that like this purity politics that like I've got to do only the right thing, and if I don't, therefore I'm wrong, is really a product of white supremacy and perfectionism. And I make mistakes all the time. You don't know how many times I was scolded by the elders council in my community for going out and saying the wrong thing publicly. But if I wasn't willing to take that risk to do that and to be able to speak to my decisions to my elders council and know that that's the way we operate. We operate with this thing where we call each other out, but we're calling each other in to be closer. And that's the way our communities operate. So if you do something, you make a misstep and someone in an Indigenous community tells you, they're not telling you because they don't want to work with you. They're telling you because they want to work with you. If they're not telling you and they're ignoring you, then they probably don't want to work with you. But like there's a different value set that happens in our communities, and you can't be afraid. But first off, the first and foremost thing is do as much homework as you can to reduce the burden of asking someone how to do something right. No one gave me the playbook on how to work with white people or within colonial systems. No one. I had to figure that out. And I made a lot of mistakes along the way. And I got scolded along the way. And I'm still here. And I'm sorry, but as white people, you have been really comfortable for a really long time. And you want to work with us, it's time to get uncomfortable because we've had to be uncomfortable for 500 years.
I like that you've co-opted back. I mean, the term fail faster in the tech community was co-opted from Samuel Beckett, and you're taking it back and you're saying fail better, fail in a different way. Don't fail for the sake of the next innovation.
Exactly.
I think that's a great message.
Can I add one thing, Marcel? Just I see settler non-Indigenous people's role in decolonial efforts as two-part. One is supporting Indigenous-led efforts, like I just said, but another one is holding our own institutions, governments, industries accountable for the harm they're doing for our benefit. You know, so we need to be, because right now Indigenous people are bearing the brunt of the costs of that fight against colonial institutions and governments and industries. So that's, I think, a huge part of our role. You can support Indigenous people indirectly by fighting against the injustices you see in your own systems, be they local, national, provincial, whatever.
Yeah.
I think I want to add one little thing before we wrap this up, because I know we're wrapping it up, is that I want to caution people between the conflation that I am seeing between indigenizing and decolonizing. So there has been, and there continues to be, this tendency to indigenize spaces, academia, like policy, and we need that. We need Indigenous representation. We need recognition of the values and the culture and the ways of being of Indigenous peoples. That's absolutely a critical component of this transition to address the legacy of colonialism, but it's not decolonization. And this comes into when we talk about support, because are you asking Indigenous peoples to join and strengthen your work within a colonial institution? Or are you using are you like dismantling your structures to add to Indigenous systems and structures? Are you actively dismantling those structures and redistributing those resources to allow Indigenous communities and lifeways and projects and all the different solutions that they're doing to build up on that? And I think of it like this. For a long time, we've lived in these two worlds. Colonial structures have built massive cities and buildings and infrastructure, while Indigenous peoples have barely had enough to build anything for decades and centuries. And now we're in a time of reconciliation, but we're being asked constantly to continue to take from here, to continue to build and strengthen this. What we need is the deconstruction of this to build this simultaneously, rather than bring this and absorb it into the colonial structures. Indigenous peoples don't want to be assimilated and absorbed. We want the respect to build our sovereign and self-determined structures and governance, to employ and actualize our governance systems that we had fought for within our treaty agreements, which have been infringed upon and broken for centuries. So if you want to work with Indigenous peoples, ask yourself, am I working to support and build them up, or am I asking them to help build up something that I'm actively building within the colonial system? You can ask them to do that and indigenize and strengthen, and that's okay. But we also need the same amount of work actively to support Indigenous peoples to build up their own. That is a form of decolonization. That is not indigenizing. But again, indigenizing isn't bad. A different tactic. It's not decolonizing.
Hey, thank you, Ariel. We have a big long question here from Matt Borland. I'm not sure if you saw this question. I know Matt is engaged in a lot of efforts in the Faculty of Engineering toward decolonization, and he asked this very hard question. I mean, how can I build the capacity for love in my field of engineering, based on a comment made by Elder Bill in engineering? I don't know if you can answer that question, or if you want to try, but I'm going to give you both the last word on this. What can you say to people at the University of Waterloo who are feeling this kind of urgency and this frustration with their institution? And what can you say to them?
I like the love piece. I'm a little bit of like, I love that. I think that comment in here for reconciliation, we both, Indigenous peoples, and fall in love with each other, is absolutely true. I think I have this tattoo that says love is the movement, because it is. Without love, like, why are we doing this work? If we really truly believe in reconciliation and addressing the legacy of colonization and trying to find ways to build things together that support our distinct differences, but collectively understand our places in the world as an interconnected life force on this planet, then we do need to be driven by love of the skills that we're driving as engineers and science and technologists and hydrologists and academics and researchers. We need that love, and we have to be able to see each other. And we also have to, if anyone who's ever been in love, you know, it's not always comfortable. There are times where, in order to make a relationship work, you got to move through the crunchy bits. You got to lean into those moments that are a little pointy in order to find that place of comfort and trust. And I think we're in a time where we're moving through the discomfort a little bit. And some people are just like, oh, well, I don't want to do this because this is not all rainbows and flowers and hearts. But real love comes from being able to work through the hard times. And I really, truly, truly want to be able to work with allies in dismantling these systems and building something new. And that takes the idea of us loving each other, seeing each other, and finding ways to merge our worlds together that benefit everyone equally.
Thank you, Ariel. It's very poetic and inspiring, hopeful. Jen, did you have any last words you want to share?
Thinking a lot about building, forging better relations, right? So what does it take to make good relationships, heal relationships that have been long wounded? And I think there's five steps, okay? But in Canada, we're trying to jump to the fifth step already. But the first step is acknowledging that you're continuing to cause harm. Second is stopping that harm. Third is making reparations. The fourth is like active, building trust through active solidarity, active allyship. And only then can you go forward together on common goals. And I feel like a lot of efforts these days is jumping to that fifth, let's go forward together, without acknowledging that harm is still happening. The harm is happening because Indigenous people still only have 0.2% of the land mass. That land is still, has not been given back. And therefore that is continuing to drive poverty conditions in so many places, So admit the harm is still happening, stop the harm, make reparations, build allyship, or build trust back through allyship and solidarity. So I think I agree with Ariel, and I agree with the person who posed the question about the importance of love, but it's very hard to build loving relations when you're still causing people harm.
Yeah, thank you for contextualizing the love. I think that's super important. Okay, I want to thank everyone for coming tonight and listening to this very powerful talk. This is going to be recorded. I mean, it's been recorded and shared, and I hope it gets out to a lot more people, because what has happened tonight is very important. And I just want to express my respect for our speakers and my thanks to Trevor as well for engaging in this talk in a very thoughtful way. And that's about all I have to say. Thank you so much, and I hope to see you again soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right.